Hey y'all, and welcome to my channel, and welcome to Learn to Quilt Lesson 4. In this lesson, we will learn how to sew all of our pieces together. So let's talk about sewing machine setup first. Now, the first thing you're going to want to do is make sure that you have the correct needle in the machine. You're going to want to sew with a size 80-12 needle that's either universal or woven. Just depending on the brand that you get. So that's the needle that you will put in your machine. You're also going to want to sew with a, I call it a generic color, but it's just kind of a color that's going to go with all of the colors. So if you're using lighter threads or lighter fabrics in your quilt, you can use, white, off-white, something like that. If you're going to use darker fabrics, you could go with brown, navy, black. If you have just a lot of multicolors, hey, great time to use up a lot of those weird off-the-wall colors of thread that you think you'll never use again. You can use 100% cotton thread. I just use actually polyester dual duty sewing thread. Never had an issue with it. Just make sure that it is your regular all-purpose thread. Don't use hand quilting thread or anything like that. You're going to want to make sure that your stitch length is about a medium size, so about halfway in between. When I turn my machine on, my machine automatically goes to the 2.4 stitch length. So that's the one I'm going to use. If you have a dial or whatever, or your stitch length goes from like 0 to 5, you can use anywhere between a 2 and a 2.5. You want to use kind of a middle of the road. It's going to be a smaller stitch. The other thing to take note of is that in quilting you use a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So that means that it is a 1/4 of an inch from your needle to the edge of your fabric. Now some machines actually come with what's called a 1/4 inch foot, so that the edge of the presser foot is exactly a 1/4 of an inch, and then you can guide the edge of your presser foot along the edge of your fabric. My presser foot here is not a 1/4 inch foot. A 1/4 inch is actually like one of these little lines here that coincides with the 1/4 inch line right here on my throat plate. Now, the best or easiest way to find out a 1/4 of an inch is to take measuring tape or a seam guide. Here is the 1/4 inch right there. And then hold it up to your needle. That's where my 1/4 inch is going to be, right here. Now, if you have a problem guiding your fabric, which I know just takes a lot of practice, or you just need some extra help, get a piece of washi tape or masking tape or painter's tape, something like that, and actually tape it on your machine throat plate like so, right where your 1/4 inch seam allowance would be. This makes it easier to guide the edge of your fabric along a straight edge. Now, it is very important. I know perfect seam allowances take practice, but you want to be as perfect as possible. Otherwise, your rows and your columns of squares won't match, and you'll end up with a wonky quilt instead of something that's straight. So go ahead and set up your machine, and then we will start sewing. All right, so I have my sewing machine all set up, got my tape on there at the 1/4 inch, and so now it's time to start sewing our blocks. So whether you're using pins or you've just laid the blocks on top of each other, you're going to start by sewing block 1 to block 2 at the 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now, you do not backstitch on these. You don't need the extra strength or the extra stitches. So you're just going to sew down at your 1/4 inch. and then clip your threads. Now I'm showing you on one of the 9 patch blocks that I put together in the previous video, but you would do the same thing if you're just doing the random rows. You would just start with row 1, put together block 1 and 2, and then join block 3 to block 2, join block 4 to block 3, and continue until you're done with the row. You always want to sew your rows across before you sew your rows down. So you would continue doing this for each row. So normally I would have like 14 blocks across, or however many I'm doing across. So that would be my row 1. Then I would start and do my row 2 right after that. And you would continue sewing until you have all your rows. Now let's talk about pressing. All right, so when it comes to pressing, there's a couple different thoughts on this that you'll see. Sometimes you'll see people will press their seams open, and sometimes you'll see they will press their seams to one side. They're kind of interchangeable. I tend to a lot of times press my seams open. You can, however, press them to one side. The thing that you want to remember, though, when it comes to pressing is that you're trying to alleviate bulk. You don't want a bunch of bulk in your seams, especially if you ever get into quilting a lot of tinier pieces and things like that. You don't want where the seams meet to have a lot of extra bulk. So when you go to sew your blocks together, or sew your rows together, you will be matching up your seams. If you press them open, it's really easy. You have pretty much equal bulk on both sides, and you want to make sure that you match up your seams correctly. If you choose to press to one side, you can definitely do that, but when you go to sew your rows together, you want to make sure that your seam allowances are pressed in opposite directions. And I'll show you a sample of this. Now the pressing is very important. Do not skip it. It is essential when you are quilting that you need to press. All right, if you do choose to press to one side, you'll see I have this one pressed this direction. I have this one pressed this direction. That way, when I go to match them up, you will see that it alleviates the bulk. One is on facing one side, one is facing the other side. So when I match up those seams, you don't end up with one side being really thick because all the seam allowances are on one side. Okay, so whichever way you do it, I feel like the pressing to one side is kind of the old school way, and the pressing your seams open seems to be the way that I see a lot of people doing it now. I don't, as I said, I don't think really there's a right or wrong reason to either one. But you do need to just make sure that you are doing this. So once you have, as I said, you're going to sew all your rows across first until you get however many rows you're doing. If you're following along with what I'm doing in the 4.5 inch squares, then you've sewn 14 squares across and you have 17 rows. Okay, so once you have that done and everything pressed, then I'll come back and I will show you how then you sew your rows together. If you're doing your patchwork, the 9-piece patchwork here in the squares, you would sew all 3 rows together to in your square. Let me get these centered right. You would sew all 3 rows together. Then you will go back and sew each row together like that and like that to form your square. You would do this with all and put together all your big squares. Then you would go back and join your big squares together. Okay, so I'm going to continue sewing a bunch together, and then I will come back at the end of the video and go over a little bit more on joining the rows. All right, so now that you have your strips sewn together, like this one here, I've got 14 squares across. Now it's time to join our rows together. Now, a couple things to remember as you're sewing your squares together. Remember, if you have a directional print like this one, where the print on it goes one direction, that you sew them together with your print going up. You don't want, you know, something standing on its head. Also, remember to be very careful with your seam allowances. You need to sew as perfect to that 1/4 inch as possible. I know, especially if you're new to sewing, that can take some practice, but you want to make sure that you're as close as possible. That way, when you go to join your squares, they meet. If you're sewing with different seam allowances or it's crooked, then your points or your little corners are not going to meet, and it's very important that they do. So once you have all of your rows sewn together, or if you're doing the 9 patch blocks, once you have all of your big squares sewn together, it's a good idea to go ahead and lay them out again. You know, on the floor, table, bed, wherever you have a large surface, lay out your rows again and make sure that you like the way it looks. This is the time where if you want to, you know, switch rows around, move your blocks around, however you want to do it, now's the time. Remember, quilting is like painting. It's art. It's up to you. You are the artist on this. It's if you like it, that's all that matters. If you don't, change it. If you need to unpick a seam to move a square around because you don't like the way it looks, do it. Now's the time to make any changes before we sew and complete the quilt top. As we sew these rows together, or as you sew your large squares together, you will be putting together your quilt top. So what you're going to do is you will lay your first row and you will turn over right sides together with the second row. And I would definitely say use pins on this. I still use pins after all these years. But you want to start by matching your seams. You want to make sure that your seams match up and then pin it in place. Okay? Then if you want to, you can pin the edge, and you're going to go down to the next seam. You're going to match that up, and you're going to pin it, and you're going to do that completely for your entire row. Then you'll go back and you'll sew with your 1/4 inch seam your entire row all the way down. You'll flip it over, you'll have one sewn. You're going to go back, do the same thing you did, press your seam, open it up. Now you'll take your 3rd row, which will be here, right sides together, pin it, sew it, and you're going to continue doing that for your entire quilt top. If you have your 9 patch squares, you will sew 1 square to the square next to it down the center. And basically it's another step. So you're going to sew all your squares together in a larger row, and then go down and do your next squares in a larger row. Then once you have those sewn and pressed, then you'll go back and you'll sew your rows together this way. All right, so you're going to continue doing that for the entire quilt top. Once mine's done, I will show you a finished product of the quilt top, and then you will be ready for the next lesson.